So the French and Indian Wars, you had a lot of French and Indian wars before the French and Indian War. So most people are familiar with the French and Indian War, the one that preceded the American Revolution, because it's considered one of the factors for why the American Revolution actually took place. If you were to go to Winston Churchill actually said that it was a world war. The French and Indian War, the 1754 to 1763, and the dates are a little off. Because why, the French and Indian War, they also call it the 7 Years' War, but it lasted for 9 years. So what the fuck is up with that? But this main point, I want to make it very clear. The French and Indian Wars, that was also called Intercolonial Wars. And it preceded, you had the 1600s were the Beaver Wars, and then the 1700s was the French and Indian Wars. So there's the one that George Washington started, and the one that George Washington started is the one that we're more familiar with, 1754 to 1763. Pontiac's Rebellion happens, and then, 10 years down the road, you get the American Revolution. Now, the other French and Indian Wars, besides the one that George Washington started, was King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and then the French and Indian War. And I'm going to say them again because this is important shit. These are, in America, they're known as the French and Indian War because that's what the British had called them. And in a way, it's not a bad name. The reason why the reason why it is a bad name is because they're assuming that the Indians sided with the French. Now, that wasn't always true. The British had Native American allies, but the reason why the French were able to win the King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War was because of their predominantly Native American allies, because they were able to mobilize the Native Americans more effectively and better, and that's why the French were able to win the first intercolonial French and Indian Wars. So the first one, King William's War, this is the first intercolonial war. This happened 1688 to 1697. King William of William and Mary. So, there was William of Orange. He's like a Dutch guy from Germany, or he comes in and he takes over King James, and then that's the Glorious Revolution. That's who that is. That's who King William is. So King William, for 9 years, 1688 to 1697, you had King William's War. Now, a lot of these wars spilled over from the European conflict. So the European was the War of the Grand Alliance, War of the League of Augsburg, the 9 Years' War. That's what the European war, but then because the European was fighting, and that's one of the things that all these intercolonial wars have in common, was that they were all between France and England. So the Europeans, there'd be a war going on in Europe, and then it would spill over to the colonies in North America. So King William's War, 1688 to 1697. Then you have Queen Anne's War, which starts up just 5 years after King William's War ended. So Queen Anne's War lasted from 1702 to 1713. Queen Anne, this is the Anne that makes Britain great. It was just England, and then it became Great Britain because she adopted Scotland and maybe Ireland or something, I don't know, but that's when Britain became great. It became Great Britain, because look at all these extra, colonies that we got around here. So Queen Anne, 1702 to 1713, Queen Anne's War. That's the second French and Indian War. King William's War was the first one, Queen Anne's War is the second one, then King George's War is 1744 to 1748. Also known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. The War of Jenkins' Ear lasted for 9 fucking years. It's around the same time. It was the War of Austrian Secession. That's why King George's War from 1744 to 1748. Now, that's an important war because that precedes the French and Indian War. There's actually 2 other wars between England and France that are nestled in between all these wars. The War of Spanish Secession is what spilled over into Queen Anne's War. So, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and then the French and Indian War. So there's 4 French and Indian Wars that start from 1688 to 1763. So for about 80 years, there's an 80-year span of the French and the English fighting. Now, some conflicts involved the Spanish and the Dutch forces, but all of them pitted the Kingdom of Great Britain, its colonies, and Native American allies on one side against France. her colonies and her Native American allies on the other. So all four of these, wars, French and Indian Wars, was against French and Indians and Britain and Indians, or Native Americans. Now, the Indians, there might be some tenuous connection to India, so there actually could be a connection with them, but in general, Native Americans is what I call Indians. So the other two wars besides the four, so those are the four main ones, and these are, Winston Churchill said there's a world war. So the first French and Indian War was a world war, the fourth Intercolonial War, the fourth one. But how many people, most Americans don't know any of these. They don't know King William's War, they don't know Queen Anne's War, they don't know King George's War. War of Jenkins' ear, that's like some guy got his ear cut off by the Spanish, and they said, here, take it up with your king, and so eventually he did. Eventually a piece of his ear goes to Parliament, and they're like, look at this. And then his ear, Jenkins was a colonel, and they cut his ear off. They was able to get them to declare war against, the people they was trying to go declare their war against. The Acadians or some shit, I don't know. But the other two wars that are included, that are nestled in between 1688 and 1763, would be Father Rale, R-A-L-E, Father Rale's War, and then Father Le Loutre. So Father Le Loutre had a war, and then Father Rale had a war. Father Le Loutre, Father Rale, they're in between. One of them's like earlier in the 1700s, and then the other one is in between King George's War and the French and Indian War. So there's, in all, there's 6 main wars, if you want to count them, because that's how, when I think of history, either it's by the decade, by the president, by the leadership, or by the wars. Wars are a good way to break periods up, because, they're world wars, so they changed everything. The last French and Indian War banishes all the French territories out of North America. They only had a couple of them in the Caribbean islands, but they didn't have any more claims to North America. Prior to then, they had all the Mississippi Valley, the Hudson Valley, they had Canada. They had a lot of area. The French had a lot of land until after the fourth French and Indian War, the one that ends 1763. Now, there's several similarities between all of them, right? Britain and France for each one of them. Now, the reason why Britain was able to win its final battle was they could supply their troops better with munitions and food and, clothing and uniforms and whatnot. So Britain had the wealth and the treasure to fund their redcoats, and then Britain also had a powerful navy. So Britain would be focused on controlling the sea, make sure France couldn't get any of their supply ships anywhere, any of their soldiers. They captured several supply ships, and the only way France was able to win all these other King George's War, King William's War, and Queen Anne's War, the reason why the French actually won, so these monarchs, they lost, right? The reason why the French had won these wars was because they was able to mobilize the Native Americans better. Now, we can argue about whether they won or lost. A lot of times, the boundaries would go right back, where it was before. And there was a big thing with Port Royal. The Pennsylvanians, or the colonies, the British colonies, took over Port Royal. And then in Europe, they said that Port Royal had to go back to the French. And so even though the colonists had fought for their lives, and then it happened, on the other way too. So there was a fort that the French had took over, but because there was a treaty, those fucking aristocrats over in Europe signed a treaty, they had swapped them. They switched them. So it's easy to say, well, on a map, when you're looking at maps and you're looking at, a bunch of aristocratic people that don't want to fight their own battles. But if you're the actual soldier, you fought, you took over Port Royal, and then it's just given back just because. Like, I can see why they would be pretty pissed. So that's the reason why the French had won, because effective mobilization of Native American allies, but they were finally overwhelmed the fourth and last war. So the British had the greater ability to resupply their colonies and project military power by sea. Now, without the threat of the French invasion, The American colonies saw little need for British military protection. In addition, the people resented British efforts to limit their colonization of the new French territories to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, as stated in the Proclamation of 1763, in an effort to relieve encroachment on Native American territory. These pressures contributed to the American Revolutionary War. So those are the two, similarities and differences. They're all Britain and France. They're, English or Britain or Great Britain, however you want to put it. And they were colonies, and they all spilled over from a bigger conflict. The reason why the 7 Years' War is named 7 Years' War instead of 9 years, there's already another 9 Years' War. But the reason why the 7 Years' War, because in Europe, they said that it was only from 1756 to 63. But in North America, we started 2 years early, and so we were able to wrap our shit up 2 years earlier here. So it was 7 years in terms of fighting over here or fighting over there, but it was the Treaty of Paris, the first Treaty of Paris, 1763, that ended the French and Indian War, that, stops the French from occupying North America. So the French and Indian Wars are huge. This is also where we see George Washington. He shot some of the French. He ambushed the French in the Ohio Valley, and he kills the leader, and then he signs... they force him to surrender. He signs a document saying that he assassinated the people that they ambushed, which it sounds like he did. And so it's starting this fucking shit, right? But in Parliament, there was some guy that said, why are we going to fight this battle? And, we're going to start a world war over just a fucking skirmish in the backwoods, in the middle of fucking nowhere. And that's absolutely what had happened. So the Fourth French and Indian War was the tail that wagged the dog. So George Washington and Robert Dinwiddie, they had the Ohio Valley Company, so they were speculating on land in the Ohio Valley. Robert Dinwiddie, the Virginian royal governor, the British governor of Virginia at the time, or the lieutenant governor, sends George Washington out to tell the French to get the hell out of there because they want to own the property and own all that land. The French were nice about it, invited Washington and all this shit, but was like, we refuse your thing, and sent him back on his way. And then eventually they come back out again, and they ambush some French people who were just walking around, in the woods. Supposedly wasn't supposed to be a battle, wasn't supposed to be anything, but they just fired upon them, and then they wound up killing them all. And so that skirmish, which they put at 1754, I forget the name of the guy, Jumonville, the Battle of Jumonville, and they put that as the beginning date of the French and Indian War, but it wasn't formally declared until 2 years later. So it was started by George Washington. He fucking ambushed, this French patrol, and then 2 years later, both France and England was involved in not just the war in the colonies, but, across the world. There's also something to do with India. That's why they say they're world wars, because there was a lot of colonies. It wasn't just the colonies in North America, but all the colonies throughout the world were in conflict with one another. So that's important. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and the French and Indian War. Those are the 4 French and Indian Wars. The 1700s. When I think of the 1600s, I think of Beaver Wars. And so I think you could get away with thinking about Beaver Wars being in the 1600s. And then the French and Indian Wars being in the 1700s up until the Revolution. So I think it's easy to think like that, even though it's a generalization, and so usually that's a bad idea. But it's French and England versus, the whole time English versus the French, and then the Beaver Wars. There was King Philip's War, Metacomet's War. There was the Massacre of Mystic River. They call it the Beaver Wars, but it was just really about power, prestige, land, wealth, and shit like that. So it wasn't totally just about beavers and the trade of beavers, but the beaver trade, the Native Americans would get these beaver pelts, send it back. That's how they got food, water, or the guns and weapons. And so it started a type of trade, right? You can get these pelts, and they could sew this nice fancy fucking fur coats and shit and whatever. So yeah, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and then the French and Indian War. Those are your 4 intercolonial wars, and those are your 4 French and Indian Wars. Most Americans don't know about the French and Indian War, let alone about the 4 French and Indian Wars total, including the 3 that was fought before George Washington started the 4th French and Indian War, the 4th Intercolonial War. So, peace.